Okay, a very good afternoon to all of you. What we're talking about today is a very simple idea, and for those of you who like The Lord of the Rings, I hope you get the reference. All right, so the idea is really simple. It is that all cash, no matter who it belongs to, should always be productive, earning a reasonable rate of return, and it should be doing that all the time. Now, until blockchains became fast, that wasn't really a feasible idea, but it is now. And you don't need me to tell you how big of a deal stablecoins are and how big of a deal they're becoming. But what I am here to tell you and talk to you about today is how a simple shift in the way yield-bearing stablecoins are conceived of and designed takes stablecoins from being a killer use case for blockchain to being a gateway product for all of TradFi, DeFi, and RWA. In other words, they can become a entry point for pretty much all of global finance. And to really kind of drive that point home, my humble contention is that those of you who actually grasp what I'm getting at and then have the courage to create products and execute well on those strategies stand to become kingmakers in global finance. Now, you're going to be wondering, what the heck is this guy talking about? Because there's always a catch. If the prize is the global kingmaker in finance, there's always a catch. And the catch is you need to be a little patient, because the product I'm going to talk about needs patient capital to incubate the product for about a year before you can actually put it out into the world. So let's get to the weeds. Most of you are aware that the EU and the US passed legislation to allow issuance of stablecoins by banks and financial institutions in the EU and the US. It's MiCA in the EU and it's the Genius Act in the US. But what neither of those pieces of legislation allow is yield-bearing stables. And that is understandable because the regulators in the EU and the regulators in the US and the central banks are very concerned about capital flight out of the domestic banking system. And that's fine. That's understandable. That's what they're doing. It does, however, create a very interesting contrast, because over in the Middle East, specifically in the UAE, in Dubai and Abu Dhabi, where I'm based, you have rule books and license regulations which have recently been updated, which actually give you a much more flexible design space for creating yield-bearing stables. So my simple suggestion is that you can actually create a yield-bearing stable in and from the UAE on top of a regulated stable which you create in the US or the EU. So very simply, if you were to make a really simple proof of concept, you could take some amount of euros or dollars, deposit that in an EU or a US bank, right? That bank would then issue you a regulated stable, which is redeemable with deposits that are covered by deposit insurance in the US or the EU. You then take that regulated stable, deposit it in a smart contract, which is controlled by a Category 1 token issuance business in Dubai, for example, which is the license you'd need to actually issue a non-dirham denominated stablecoin, like a euro or a USD denominated stablecoin, and then incubate that for about a year. Okay? What you can do after a year is, for 1 year, you just take that regulated stable, convert it to USDC, convert it to USDT, convert it to fiat, and earn a really simple unleveraged yield on it. Take no risk and just earn 3.5% on it, right? And then at the end of 1 year, you effectively have $1 million in regulated stables, for example, and you have the ability to create a 3-token structure. So you create the stablecoin itself, which is the principal token. You create a low-risk yield token attached to that principal token, and you create a high-risk yield token attached to that principal token. And what you do, I'll illustrate it a little more on the next slide because that's a diagram, so it probably makes it a little easier, because that's a bit of an alphabet soup. So you'd go deposit, just like a proof of concept, you'd go deposit, let's say, $1 million with a bank in the EU or the US. That bank would issue you a regulated stable. That regulated stable gets deposited in a smart contract controlled by a stablecoin issuance business in the UAE. You then convert that back to USDT, USDC, fiat, go earn simple 3.5% yield on it for a year. At the end of 1 year, you effectively have your million plus about $35,000 in yield. And what you then do is you create the 3-token structure, which is principal token, low risk, and high risk yield token. And let's say $17,500 off that $35,000 in yield is payable to the low risk yield token holders. And the other $17,500 is payable to the other $17,500 you actually use to fund the high risk yield token. So that becomes seed capital for the high risk yield token. So now what you have is you have a stablecoin product with an attached low risk yield token and an attached high risk yield token. And what that does is by the end of year 2, you have 2 years of yield accrued on the low risk yield and 1 year of accrued yield on the high risk yield. You can release the product at the end of year 1. But the interesting thing is you then have the ability to issue these as 3 tokens attached to each other, which are then separately tradable as well, right? Now, of course, there are benefits and there are risks. The 2 main benefits that I would talk about are, number one, using a very simple mechanism, you are aligning regulatory incentives, right? You are not taking deposits away from the EU and the US. If I want to increase issuance of the yield-bearing stable out of the UAE, I actually need to increase fiat deposits in the EU or the US. So for the regulators there, they love it. They can't anything but love it. The second thing that happens is it's a stablecoin product. And because it's a stablecoin product, the institutional investor and retail investor distinction is irrelevant. It does not apply, right? So what you've suddenly done with this simple shift is you've created a stablecoin product which effectively becomes infinite AUM for global asset managers, right? Because you're able to mobilize bank deposits, right? Yes, there are risks and considerations, but that always happens. But for those risks and considerations, you actually do have fairly robust risk management methods in asset management already and in on-chain management already. So I don't think that it really expands the risk pie that much, but it does expand the benefit pie. Okay, there are some design decisions you're going to have to make. For example, the timing of the payouts. Do you reinvest the yield from low risk into high risk, or do you take the payouts? And that stuff those are design decisions you can make as an issuer, right? You have the option to take the yield payout or reinvest, which I just talked about, and you can split them and make them separately tradable, which to me is a very powerful part of the idea itself, right? Then, obviously, you need good layer ones, and you need settlement infrastructure for this. You need faster layer ones with security guarantees. You need sustainable two-way funnels. And all of these ramps, clearing, and settlement infrastructure, which I'm talking about here, all of that stuff is being built. You know, you've got somebody like Ubix building a clearing system for stablecoins, trying to get them to singleness of money so that a stablecoin is always equivalent to cash, whether that is a stablecoin being used on-chain or it's being used off-chain in the real world, right? Now, all of this kind of ties together if I give you a couple of examples, right? 2 simple examples. Because you're creating a 3-token structure, that 3-token structure then effectively allows you to make any capital, whether it's sitting off-chain or whether it's sitting on-chain, just baseline more productive, right? So I'll give you 2 examples of how you can take this stablecoin concept and this product shift and apply it in the real world in a way that illustrates to you that capital actually is more efficient. The first example is just a simple savings product, right? There's no reason why a bank, even a Turkish bank, can't mobilize deposits, do a structure like this where they basically funnel a number of customer deposits into, or simply they make available a product. They make available a product to customers, which is a savings product. That savings product customers can allocate to. That AUM then gets taken by the bank and allocated into a structure like this, where they take that, deposit that with EU and US banks, convert that to a yield-bearing stable out of the UAE, and then generate AU and then generate low risk and high risk yield on it, and pay that proportionately back as a savings product onshore in Turkey after keeping a spread, right? The other less obvious example I'll give you is bankruptcy, right? Because my other areas of practice tend to be bankruptcy and insolvency. So in bankruptcy, distressed debt investing is like a total thing, right? And what happens is a distressed debt investor sometimes wants to turn around a company which has good bones, right? It might be a manufacturing company, it might be a logistics company, whatever it is. It's got good bones, but it took on too much debt and it's in stress. Now, usually when you want to do a court-based restructuring or an out-of-court restructuring with the creditors, usually a white knight investor will have to put in a certain amount of money. There's no way I can convince a court in a jurisdiction to let me take over a company and basically shave off a bunch of debt from the balance sheet, therefore forcing creditors to take a haircut without putting up a bunch of cash myself. I'd usually have to put up that cash into a bank deposit. So let's say I need $10 million to take over the equity of a company which used to be worth $100 million. I could do that, but I usually then need additional capital and additional cash to restart the supply chain, to actually get my suppliers willing to supply and deal with me because they haven't been paid for months on end. So in that situation, if you have been keeping your capital in a yield-bearing stable like this, you essentially can use the principal token to pay a deposit so that the court actually allows you to take over the company's equity, and you use the low risk and the high risk yield tokens, which will have a couple of years of accrued returns on them. You deal that to the suppliers, because again, those are cash equivalents and it's just accrued yield which you can again redeem, right? So that's just one way of making that capital just much more efficient, right? And like I said, the interesting thing with this is that if you're able to execute this at scale, once you proof of concept it with something like $1 or $2 million, you can push $1 billion or $2 billion or $10 billion through it, and you become a kingmaker in global finance because all of a sudden I have 10 billion that I need to allocate to asset managers for low risk yield and high risk yield, right? And again, the interesting part about it is it's a stable coin, right? Everybody can own and buy and trade a stable coin. The retail investor distinction doesn't apply. That's it. That's a really simple idea, and I hope you got something good from it. Thank you. All right.